We have a couple, oh my, we have one youth who's not attending and two other kids from youth group who've been suicidal or come very close to an ICU, so, and then some other difficult things, so just be in prayer for those kids as well. So anyway, this week we are continuing, whoa, I just got louder there. Anyway, this week we're continuing looking at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. And today we're going to spend most of our time in James 3, 13 through 18. But in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 9, we're looking at the last, we didn't go through these in order, but we're looking at the last beatitude, the last attitude that I believe is going to give us what Jesus gave as a good description of what a Christian looks like. If you want to know, what does it look like to be a Christian, or how can we know who's going to receive the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus says, like what does that really consist of? And this is the last description that's really give us that clear picture of what those who will receive the kingdom of heaven, those who will receive the earth and everything that Jesus says, this is the qualities, this is the attitudes, this is what they look like. And this is the last one we're looking at in Matthew 9. It says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." And so if you're wondering what a peacemaker is, that's a parent of 4 children. They're like, quiet, stop it, cut it out, stop, no, don't, stop, shh, quiet. No, I don't. That's not the same kind of peacemaker. There's several thoughts that kind of roll into this. You could, maybe people think of, what do they think of? Is it these beauty pageant winners? Miss America. She's like, oh, this and this and this, and then and world peace or whatever. It's like, just this goal that you have of some sort of peace on earth or something like that. But as a Christian, a peacemaker, there's a lot of people who have different thoughts on this because, for one thing, there's no peace outside of Jesus Christ. By bringing his kingdom to reign on this earth, you're bringing in a type of Christian peace. But that's not always even accepted with open arms. There may be conflict involved in that type of peace, but I think that there's something that goes with this that is actually, it's an attitude of just being peaceable or creating a peaceful environment amongst yourself. I think that's definitely entailed in here. When we look at all of the things that Jesus lists, and we look at that, he says, people who are meek and lowly, and these people who are humble, and these people, and then he says, and peacemakers. I think it definitely, the attitude of a Christian certainly is someone who's a very peaceable person, someone who is creating a peaceful environment. They're not brash and harsh. And one of my thoughts was, I think I seen somewhere a picture of Steve Smith with long hair. I seen that, right? Back in the 70s, they had people who were very peaceful, but maybe too peaceful. But I don't think that's quite what we're looking at here. But when it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God," I think this is something. Once again, I've told you each of these qualities. I'm like, these qualities. Over and over, I've told you. I think he's saying this. Blessed means they are going to receive the kingdom of heaven. When he says blessed, I think he means like they're my children. And once again with this, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers. They should be called the sons of God." I mean, that's very tying them into his family, isn't it? I mean, if you want to be looked at and you want people to look at you and you want God to look down on you and say, "That's my child," if someone said that somebody just spilled a box of cereal all over downstairs, I'd be like, I don't even need to look. That was one of mine. That's just like them. That's the sort of thing my kids do. Blessed are the mess makers. They should be called the sons of Nate. Karen knows. Karen's shaking her head. She knows that pretty well. But, wouldn't that be good? Wouldn't that be amazing to know that God looks down on you and he says, there are peacemakers. And he says, yeah, that's my kids. They're the sons of God. That is mine. They belong to me. That is a telltale sign. When people look at my kids, They look down the line, they look at Audrey, Joe, Baber, like, yep, yep, yep. And then they get to Simeon, they're like, where'd this curly hair come from? Where'd that come from? But Claire's dad has really curly hair, and Claire has curly hair, and he's also a mess maker. I know he's my son. But generally, there's this resemblance. If you want to be called even an adopted son of God, if you want recognition, you want to look like your father, you need to have the attitude that he has. People should be able to look to you and say, yeah, you know what? Look at that peaceable attitude. There is someone who is a peacemaker. There is someone who is a son of God. In the Greek translation of this, somewhere I have that in here, and I'm not even sure where I lost it in my notes, but in the Greek translation, this only translates into 2 words in English. It's either peacemaker or a peaceable person. When they look at you and they're like, man, there is someone who is they have a peaceable mentality. And not only are they peaceable, but they kind of make peace with the people around them. They're not getting along. They're just a very peaceable person. And when we look at all these attitudes, there shouldn't be an attitude of quarrelsome attitude amongst children of God. If you're wanting to look like them, I shouldn't see like I see, maybe my little kids or someone immature fighting. I shouldn't see people fighting over a hymnal, give me it. No, I saw it first. Give me it. It's mine. You said give it to me. But anyway, you shouldn't see. And this goes far beyond, these silly things, but you really shouldn't see that quarrelsome attitude among children of God. There should be a very obvious, like I look at them and I say, yeah, that I know where they belong to. I know where they come from. I know where that attitude generated from because they are a peaceable nature. And as we look at this, I want to look in James 3:13. And James says this. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? He says, by his conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So that's like saying, that's like if I were to look out at this congregation and I said, who here is wise? Who among you is mature? Who I would say could be an elder or a leader, or who is a representative of someone who is spiritually wise and advanced in God? And I said, you know what? Let him show that in the meekness of his wisdom. Let him show it in the kindness, gentleness, the laid-back attitude of his wisdom. Let his conduct display that he knows what the wisdom from God is. And here in verse 14, James continues and he says, but where bitterness and jealousy exist and selfish ambition in your hearts, he says, do not be proud while you're missing the truth. If you've ever met someone who's kind of brash, maybe snotty or snooty, and they're kind of proud of it, they're like, oh, and they're not a kind, they're not peaceable, they're kind of a loud, brash, the sort of person, and then they're proud of it. They're like, oh, I told him this and I told him that, and it's like they have a sense of pride. James says, well, wait a minute. He says, don't have any pride there while you're completely missing the truth. While you have that wisdom is not that's not mature in God. There's nothing to be proud of in that attitude. Why would anyone be proud of something like that? He says, if that's your attitude, that there's just quarrelsome vibe coming from you, and you think that you're something special for laying down the law like that, he says, while you're completely missing the truth, he says, there shouldn't be any pride in that sort of attitude. And then, when we look at this, and it says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And we're looking at trying to resemble our Father, trying to show that where we came from and who we belong to. Jesus said that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. And just a little further down, if we are to go down in this same message that Jesus is giving, and we're going to go down to verse 44, Jesus says this. He says, but I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. He says, because your Father, he says, makes the sun rise on both the good and the evil, and he makes the rain fall on both the just and the unjust. Jesus says, do you want to be a child of your Father or not? Do you want to be part of that family? Do you want to be part of me and a child of mine? He says, do you know how your Father acts? He says, have you ever looked around? He says, do you see how your Father makes the sun rise on the just and the unjust alike, and makes the rain fall on the good and the evil? He says, if you want to be a child of your Father, he says, you ought to have that peaceable nature. You ought to be someone who gets along and even prays for those who persecute you. He says, if you want to be a child of your Father, people should look at you and say, man, why are they so kind to these people? Why do they treat them like that when those people treat them like garbage? And then they'll say, but that's what their father's like. That's what their dad is like. I'm now identifying them as a child of God because I see the peaceable nature that they have. They say, they make that equation, and Jesus says twice, back to back, he says, the peacemakers are going to be called the sons of God, and not only that, but if you want to be a child of God, you better be able to treat people the way your Father treats people if you want to be his child, if you want to have that relationship, if you want to have that connection to them. So going back to James, James continues, and he's talking about, these people who have that attitude of kind of this snooty, selfish, self-centered ambition, who think they can be proud of who they are because they're this law-laying down sort of people. These people who are really just kind of spewing their own personality out on other people, and they're not peaceable, they're not kind, they're not gentle and meek and this sort of thing. And this is what James says about those people. He says, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above. He says, this isn't coming from your Father. He says, you didn't get that from him. He says, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above. He says, but this is earthly. And he says, it is unspiritual, and in fact, it's demonic. You know where that sort of attitude came from? You know what that generated from? He says, that's not coming down from God. He says, that's coming up from Satan. He says, you're really displaying the attitude of someone who's a child of the wrong father. He says, that is not where this came from. And Jesus says for some reason, I didn't put I think this is from John 8, but I didn't put John 8 in here, but I'm 99% sure this is from John 8. But I know it's verse 44. But Jesus says to these people who aren't accepting his teaching, he says, you are of your father, the devil. He says, and your desire is to do your father's desire. And he says, Satan has been a murderer from the beginning, and he has never held to the truth. Jesus says, he's not saying that people are actually born of Satan. He's not saying that Satan is their biological father. But he's saying by their nature, they show whether they're a child of God or a child of Satan. He says they're showing who they belong to, and they're showing where they came from, even if they have been adopted into the family. They show where they belong by the actions that they produce and the things that they do. So James continues in verse 16, and he says, where jealousy and selfish ambition exists, he says there will be disorder and every type of vile thing. He says where your attitude is not the attitude that God would give you, not the wisdom that came from above, he said there's just going to be disaster that's going to follow, disaster that's going to ensue. He says that sort of brash personality is not going to produce anything that's good, no good quality. He says it's going to produce only bad. And then he says, but the wisdom that comes from above. And then he lists this. He says, this is what that wisdom comes from above is like. This is what it looks like. This is the quality that God, your Father, is giving you. He says, it is first pure, then peaceable, then gentle. He said it is open to reason. He says it's full of mercy and good. He says it is impartial and sincere. Can you imagine working with people like that? Can you imagine having coworkers and fellow brothers in the church who are like that? Who have the wisdom that came down from their Father God? Can you imagine having people that first are focused on purity, they're focused on what is right, and then they're peaceable? Man, isn't it good to work with people who are peaceable? You're just like, they're just not a basket case, they're not wound up, they're just peaceable people. They're just good people to be around. And then he says they're gentle. Being around people who are of the Father, who are gentle, is a good sort of people to be around. And then he says they're open to reason. Man, they're not just set on their own ways. They're like, you sure we can do it your way? That's fine. Yeah, I'm open to listen. Yeah, that works good. They're a peaceable person. And then he says that they're full of mercy and good, and it says they're impartial and sincere. So they're not set on their own ways. They can work with people. They can get along with people. And it's such a wonderful type of person to be around. And then James ends with this, and we'll end with this as well. But he says in verse 18, he says, and a harvest of good is grown from people who are peacemakers. He says, when you are with someone who is a peacemaker, he says that there is like a garden of good things that are coming from behind them. He says everywhere they go, they're growing things that are good and beneficial. God's hand of blessing is with what they're doing. And when you have that person who's got that peaceable nature, who's creating peace and is a peacemaker, man, the people around them, everything that they're doing, the things that they have their hands to, the work that they're doing, he says is going to produce this crop of good things. As opposed to the people who are in this brash personality, who are not peacemakers, who are not producing the fruits of their Father in heaven, who are producing the fruits of Satan below, who have a personality of self-centeredness and brashness and harshness. He says when you come across a peacemaker, everything they do is like a garden of good things around them, and we can appreciate what is coming from the work that they're doing and who that they are. So in closing today, this whole idea in the Bible of who we are, I hope that when we've looked at all of these qualities of what a Christian should look like. And in many of them, this is a reoccurring theme throughout all of this, that they are a peaceable person, that they make peace, that the spirit of a Christian is a gentle spirit, and it may endure persecution, it may face resistance, you may face hard times, but you're a peaceable person, and you make peace, and the things around you do well, and they prosper, because this is what God has created us to be. And if we want to be identified as children of His, we should work to embrace our adopted nature so that people can identify us as children of our Father who's in heaven. So we'll have a closing song this morning.